Hi, everyone. We're going to get started again. So for our next and last panel of the day, it is my privilege to introduce Charles Franklin. Charles is a professor of law and public policy at Marquette. He also likely needs no introduction to anyone who follows Wisconsin politics and polling closely because he's the director of the very well-known and respected Marquette University Law Poll, which is the standard to any of us who watch and are interested in both Wisconsin polling and of course, they do national polls as well. So with that said, I will get out of the way and pass the podium over to Professor Franklin. Thank you so much, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here. We'll try to get everybody out before too late an hour. I got to say, though, actually, and I'm not just being a sycophant here, the discussions earlier just make me want to do another day tomorrow to go into some of the topics that we've talked on, but haven't gotten too deeply into. My talk is going to be in a couple of parts, maybe 3 parts, depending, but 2 parts for sure. The first is to look at what happened. So now that we actually have election results, let's take a look at what the vote looked like, how it changed, and those kinds of details. No survey data involved. Then we'll go backwards in time and look up at the run-up to the election through the lens of our polling and briefly some of the other polling that was available in the state as well. And then finally, I want to turn a little bit to issues and some things about the candidate characteristics. And that part is contingent on how time goes. And we'll go to that if we need to or can, but it's not mandatory for me. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A as well. So these have been wonderful questions all day as well. Okay, so there we go. This is the vote for governor by the county level. And you see the cluster of blue around Dane County, here where we are. A little bit off to the west with La Crosse in particular being pretty blue, Stevens Point and Portage County and Eau Claire, and then the Lake Superior counties that stand out as blue in a relative sea of red to their south. And finally, if you look over, of course, Milwaukee stands out and the WOW counties around that, Washington, Ozaukee, and Waukesha. And finally, I want to point you to the Fox Valley region around Green Bay, because those are very pink counties this time for the governor's race. There'll be a little bit redder in the next slide for the Senate race. And Door County standing out there on the peninsula, going a little bit blue. Time was that Wisconsin maps often looked pretty red in the eastern half of the state, with the exception of Milwaukee, and pretty blue in the western half of the state, including the Southwest, but a good chunk of the Northwest as well. Old timers will remember David Obey dominated the 7th Congressional District from 1969 until 2010. Those days are long past, and the kinds of changes that we've seen, long past meaning over the last 10 or 15 years. But the kinds of changes we've seen have really reshaped the geographic pattern of voting in the state, with this concentration of a few Democratic counties out of the 72 counties. But those are important counties because they're where so many people live. And so if you're going to punch above your weight, it really helps to be a populous place like Dane County, fastest growing county in the state for the last 15 years at least, but also incredibly high turnout rates, which we enjoy here. Milwaukee County, on the other hand, struggles a little bit with their turnout rate. And so again, that helps Dane be a more potent player in state politics, because our high turnout, our highly skewed partisan choices, and the turnout issues in Milwaukee County are pretty important. But you can certainly see the vast sea of red in other counties, particularly rural counties, but some of those places have some metro concentrations or exurb populations as well. Here's the vote for Senate. I'm going to go back and forth between them a little bit. So here's governor, and you're going to see some blues disappear and some reds darken when I go here to the Senate. Now, of course, the governor's race was a little over a 3-point Democratic victory, the Senate race a 1-point Republican victory. So, of course, there's a net 4-point shift in the margins from the first map to the second. But you see Door County is a nice example of one that was noticeably blue in the first, and it's just a bit pink in this one. Also, the Fox Valley counties of Brown, Outagamie, and Winnebago counties are now a bit red here for the Senate, and they were pinker, and in fact, one was very pale blue for governor. So there are these shifts regionally, and one reason to emphasize the Fox Valley region is that's another heavily populated area of the state, and the shifts that are taking place there, if they were to continue, have some consequences long term. Let's look at partisan shift now instead of the margins. We were just looking at the margins, but here, thankfully, since we had two incumbents running, we can compare on the left Ron Johnson's partisan margin and how that changed from 6 years ago when he was reelected in 2016. And on the right for Governor Evers, the comparison to 4 years ago. So it's a good apples to apples comparison. I'll digress for just a second to say that post-election, the New York Times had a nice national map showing the shifts in county votes. But because they needed to compare the nation to a common baseline, they used the Trump vote in 2020 as that common baseline. By that standard, most of the counties in Wisconsin shifted a little bit in a Republican direction. But if you do here and look at apples to apples comparison, I think you get a much more appropriate look for our state. I'm not dinging the Times. What they did was sensible for a national comparison, but for us, it makes more sense to look here. And here's the big point that you see in both of these maps is that the eastern part of the state is trending Democratic in most of these counties. And that is as true of the WOW counties, Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington, as it is for Dane County, for example. And so where we are seeing counties that are big populations in the Fox Valley as well as in the Milwaukee area, those bigger counties, even though they're still giving a plurality or a majority of their vote to the Republican candidates, are doing so less. And you see that's true here in both of these races. But if we go back, it's also true of the shifts from 2010 to 2014 for Governor Walker, and from 2014 to 2018 for Governor Walker. In that latter pair, his biggest decline statewide was in Waukesha County. Second biggest decline was in Ozaukee County. Washington County was in the top 10. Now you want a majority in all of those races, but it's also true of going from 2012 to 2016, going from Romney to Trump. It's also true going from Trump 16 to Trump 20. It's also true in the nonpartisan Supreme Court races. For the conservative candidate, these suburban eastern counties have become less conservative in those Supreme Court races than they were before. So this is not a phenomenon linked only to Donald Trump. It's decidedly not linked only to Donald Trump because it covers all these other candidates and even candidates like Walker from 10 to 14 pre-Trump era. So these are, I think, important things. Now, you all remember when we were told that the shifting demographics of the country was going to guarantee a massive Democratic majority by 2020. And those forecasts turned out to be just a little premature. So I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that these are somehow inexorable changes that must continue. But that said, it is reshaping our political landscape and has done so very consistently over at least the last 12 years. Now, I've focused on those eastern counties, but look at the north and west and on the reddening of those counties. So the weird thing here is we've had some really substantial change in the state, but it's tended to balance out because the movement in the north and west has significantly balanced, not completely, but significantly balanced the more pro-democratic trends in the southeast. And so this is raises some really interesting questions about where we go from here in terms of where do the parties concentrate their advertising effort. Travis, can I get this by market, by the way? How do we see those campaigns shaping up? Where does the effort go? Do Democrats only try to mobilize in Madison and Milwaukee? And I know they don't, but I'm just making a somewhat facetious point. Do Republicans only try to go out to the North Woods to organize? I think we're seeing enough shifts taking place that both parties need to consider where their efforts need to go in light of this landscape. So let's look at another way of doing this. This is the shift in the governor's margin by county, and along the bottom, the x-axis is the 2018 gubernatorial vote in the county, and on the y-axis is the 2022 gubernatorial vote. And the symbols are sized proportionally to the total vote cast there. And what do you notice? To me, it looks like planets and asteroids. The big planets are all above the diagonal line. The big places almost all moved up in a pro-democratic direction. But the little asteroids, the smaller places, not quite all, but most of them moved south below that diagonal line, giving less of a Democratic margin than they had before. An important point to make here is that if you go off there to the far left, we're looking at if only I could read it, Washington and Waukesha over here on the left. They're labeled, the two labeled ones, if you can see that. These are very Republican counties, right? But they're both above the diagonal line. Now go to some of the more competitive counties, Brown, Outagamie, Winnebago. All three of them are above the line, even though those are more moderate competitive counties. Go up to the far right and you've got Milwaukee and Dane, very Democratic counties, also above the line. So the point here is this shift of bigger places moving in a Democratic direction is independent of whether the place is a Republican area, a mixed area, or a Democratic area. We're seeing shifts across the partisan spectrum. Same story for the smaller places. Even the smaller places that are pretty Democratic became less Democratic. Again, if they were competitive, they became less Democratic. If they were very Democratic, there are not very many out there on the very top right, but before you get there, they also shifted in this direction. So this is a really consistent pattern. Look at the, on the left is population density as an alternative measure, not just total votes cast, but population density on the bottom. And vertically is the governor margin in 2022. And it's a lot of noise in this picture. There's roughly an upward slope to that, but a lot of scatter to it. Though you do see that the bigger places are almost all off to the right. They're bigger, so they're denser. And they tend to be higher, but you can't discount Waukesha and Washington that are big, but quite Republican. So if you shift and look on the right, now this is the margin change. This is what the map that we were just looking at. Now it's a much stronger relationship between population density on the bottom and that shift in a Democratic, less Republican direction. And now Washington and Waukesha don't look like outliers anymore. They look like their shifts are in line with their population density. I don't actually have the map, but we have an application, a web app, law.marquette.edu/poll, and a little bit of searching, you'll find it, that lets you look at the ward level map of every election in the state since 2000. And if you look at any county, with a few exceptions, almost any county, you'll see that the incorporated cities are bluer or at least less red than the surrounding countryside. And that density relationship that you see here applies within counties just about as much as it applies when you compare county to county. So it is something that happens at small scales and large scales. And it raises some interesting questions about why a relatively tiny town of 4,000 people in a very Republican county nevertheless doesn't look as Republican as their neighbors outside the city limits. If we move to the Senate race, we basically see the same pattern in reverse. Now, up is Johnson's vote, and so the big counties are below the diagonal line. They're voting less for Johnson, giving him a smaller margin than they did 6 years ago. The small counties above the diagonal, giving him more of a vote than he had last time. So this is just the mirror image of what we saw with the governor's race. And here again is the same things we just saw with the governor's race. And you can see the downward decline on the left, that the denser the place, the lower the Republican vote margin. But on the right, you again see that the shift from 2016 to 22 in the Senate race is really quite strongly correlated with the density of the county. And so we're seeing this pattern replicated again across two different offices against two different time spans, 16 to 22 versus 18 to 22, presidential to non-presidential to midterms. Doesn't matter who the candidates are, what the electoral circumstance is, we're seeing this pattern show up. Last way to look at this, with thanks to the Elections Commission for certifying the data this week, so I was able to get it and run this last night. What you're seeing here is the roughly 1,800 municipalities in the state. And on the horizontal axis, the x-axis, is the county level vote for governor, the county margin for governor. And then vertically is the vote in each of the municipalities within that county. So some of those are huge cities. You see the big bubbles for Madison and Milwaukee. You'll notice Milwaukee's the second vertical set here. So there are a lot of cities in Milwaukee County that are pretty populous above the line. Mostly elsewhere, it's small places that are above the line. So this just shows you something of what we saw before, but I want to highlight it in a different way. These are places that are cities from a definitional point of view by the state. We define places as city, village, and town. The village is actually the in-between one in terms of size or population. But the cities here in yellow, you see again with those exceptions in Milwaukee County, are overwhelmingly below the diagonal line. They're voting less Republican than their county voted. And on the bottom right, you see that the average difference in places that are designated as cities is 9 percentage points smaller margin for the Republican candidate compared to the county-wide vote. We move to villages, and now they're a little more scattered, though a lot of them are above the line, some of them are below the line, and the average difference here is 6.9 positive points, voting 6.9 more of a Republican margin than the county. And finally, if we go to the towns, and there are a lot of little towns, almost 14 points more Republican than Democratic. So we've looked at this in terms of simple size, total votes cast. We've looked at it in population density terms, kind of normalizing for the size of the physical as well as the population size. And here, from the legal point of view of are you a city, a village, or a town? And we see this very consistent pattern, and it does raise questions about, first of all, why is it? What is it about bigger, denser cities that makes them significantly different from the other places in that same county, right? Why is it that if you drive, 10 miles out of most cities around the state to a smaller place, you'll see this consistent difference in voting? It also raises the practical political question. If you were trying to make inroads around the state, where would you want to go? And I think on the Democratic side, you're already doing really well in the big places, but you're losing these places by a bit. Is there any way to make inroads there? The reverse for Republicans, if you're already cleaning up pretty well in the little places, you got to worry that the patterns we saw showed Democrats gaining relative vote share in the places where most people live. Well, that's not a winning formula in the long run. 99% of the vote in tiny places can't equal losing 70-30 in big places. So how do we see this work out, and what does it do? And it's also relevant to the redistricting maps because of how do you redraw the competitiveness of the state given the way our maps are drawn. Okay, so those are the big geographic patterns, and I think one of the really important things that's happening in this density divide or urban-rural divide, as you care to look at it. So I want to look at the polling just a little bit. So our last pre-election poll, we had a 2-point Johnson lead. He ended up winning by 1 point. We were 1.5 points low on Barnes and 0.5 point low on Johnson. This was our trend over time. And I think I want to dwell on it for a second. Post-primary, Barnes was ahead by 7. Coming right off the primary. We were in the field starting the day after the primary. And you'll recall, of course, that 3 of his main opponents dropped out, kind of unprecedented development. He also suffered very little negative advertising against him over the summer. And so he had really brought together the era of good feelings in the Democratic Party, won an easy victory, and I think it paid off for him. Just a side note, we saw his support go up by 5 points after the primary. We also saw Tim Michael's support go up by 5 points after he won his primary. So one of those was a hard-fought competitive primary. One was not. Both of them seem to have gotten about the same post-primary bounce. But in Barnes's case, that fell off over the next month to the second dot there in early September. And I think the stylized story is pretty convincing. Travis, again, can chime in on what the data actually show, but don't mess with me with the facts here. That is that a deluge of negative ads hit the Barnes campaign in that month. And there hadn't been much prior exposure or immunization for voters. And it dropped to a 1-point Johnson lead. Then in early October, a 6-point Johnson lead before it tightened to this 2-point lead at the end. And one of the side things that concerned me at the time was that the story of the end of the election was the red wave coming. The tsunami is back. How could it be that we were moving to a more competitive race when so much of the national storyline was saying still more of a Republican advantage? So, the data are the data. So I report the data. But it did make me wonder what's going on that's different here. Well, as it turns out, some of those tsunami arguments were a little exaggerated. And, we ended up very close to what the outcome was. Here's the same stuff, but now with everybody else's polling as well as mine. And you can see that towards the end, this was showing more than a 3-point Johnson lead across all of the polling that had been done. So we were at a 2-point margin, but they were a little over a 3.5-point margin overall. And you can also see that the dynamic is in one sense similar. A kind of agreement that Barnes was ahead very early in the fall campaign, that tightened and reversed. And here, the totality of the data looks like it was more of a flat margin through the rest, whereas we see a bit of a period where Johnson got a little more of a leg up that then contracted. But I don't think we're wildly different here, even if our margin is a little closer than to the outcome than the polling averages of everybody that was active in polling in the state. On the governor's race, we had this one tied at 48-48. We were 3.2 points low on Governor Evers, and we were off by 0.2 of a point on Tim Michels. So a little bit of an understatement of the Evers margin. Of course, he won. Here, there was less ambiguity about what was going on over the course of the campaign because this was a tight race from the beginning. It tightened from 4 points to 3 points to 1 point to a tie. But that's very little movement. Remember, the margin of error for all of these is 4 points margin of error. So we're really talking about very modest movements over time. Here's the all polling done here. And you can see, because the numbers overlap on the right, that the ultimate polling average with all of the polls in was just the tiniest edge to Michels that we had tied. But it also shows a tight race and a tightening race and less variability from poll to poll in the governor's race than the amount of variability from poll to poll that we saw in the Senate race. So what are some of the mechanisms driving that? The first is partisanship. So you have to read this from the bottom right. Well, it's too confusing to try to read it that way. In the top left is our final poll, and in the bottom right is our first poll. So in the bottom right on the governor's race, the red and blue tall bars are just showing that polarization was alive and well in the state. And we had virtually unanimous parties for their candidates. But the purple bars, independents leaning to Evers by about 11 in August. But then that's a 6-point independent lead in the bottom left, tightening a bit. The partisans are still very loyal. In the top right, now it's essentially a tie with independents, preferring Michels by 1 point, 44-43. There was a little drop off in Republican support for Michels there. I don't know if that's real or just a fluke of that particular data set, because when you go to the top left, you see virtual perfect party loyalty has been restored. The little tiny bars at 2 points each are the crossover votes, 2% of Republicans voting for Evers, 2% of Democrats voting for Michels. And the independents are now a 1 point race. If we look at the Senate race in the same terms, bottom right, Mandela Barnes had an amazing 15-point lead with independents right after the primary. But by September, he was behind by 2 points with independents. In early October, down by 6. And at the end, down by 7 with independents. So that early independent lead that helped him kind of went away. He didn't fall far behind with independents, but he did fall behind with independents. Partisans were very united, if anything, more united in the Senate race than in the governor's race. So it really wasn't differing party loyalties. So turnout rears its head. we've seen a lot of shift in what people said their motivation to vote was this year. Republicans held a lead in excitement to vote, enthusiasm for voting into June, a considerable 7-point lead in June in our data. Then come down to the bottom right, it was just 1 point difference in the percentage saying they're absolutely certain they're going to vote, 83-82, 1 point Republican advantage. In September, 77-80, still very close, maybe a little bit of an advantage to Democrats. Top right, back to 84-83, 1 point, no meaningful difference between the parties. But finally, at the end, a little bit of an advantage, 6-point Democratic advantage. We saw that was driven virtually entirely by early voting. That among early voters, that's where this Democratic, because if you've already voted, you're certain to vote, right? So we count that as a certain to vote. Of the people who had not early voted a week before the election, the parties were again equal. So where did the gap come from? It came from those early Democratic votes, at least as of a week before the election. So that little bit of a Democratic advantage at the end helped take Barnes into this very competitive 1-point race, even though he was losing independents by a little bit and breaking even on a very, very loyal Democratic cohort. Same story for Evers. I think it boosted his ultimate margin to 3 points or so. That would have been a little bit less if he'd only had to count on the partisan aspect, the partisan alignment aspect. Earlier, the conversation talked about Dobbs, and so I wanted to show you what my estimates are of the Dobbs effect. So what you see here in green are the people who favored the Dobbs decision, who favored overturning Roe versus Wade. And in the purple are the people opposed to that decision. And the thing is, if you just look at vote by opinion on Dobbs, you're confounding it with partisanship. And of course, partisan differences are huge here. So here we're breaking it out by the 5-party categories. People who think they're Democrats, people who think they're independents but feel closer to the Democratic Party, the lean Dems, pure independents, lean Republicans, and Republicans. I'm pooling the data over the last 3 polls so we have enough cases to break it out this finely. But what do you see in this? If you just focus in the left of each chart on the Evers vote, the Evers vote among those opposed to overturning Roe, opposed to Dobbs, is higher in every single chart, even though it's quite low for the 2 categories of Republicans. But among those Republicans who opposed overturning Roe, among pure Republicans, it goes from 1% to 10%. It's not exactly an electoral mandate, but it's a 9-point difference in the vote. Lean Republicans from 6 to 22. And then these really big differences among the people who are pure independents and say they don't feel closer to either party. With them, of how they felt about Dobbs made a 33-point difference in the Evers vote and 43-point difference in the Michaels vote. Really big vote differences. Among Democrats, there's still differences here, and they're not trivial differences in the lean Dems going from 56 to 83%, so on. Here's the side point I want to make. A lot of people think about abortion rights is the most important thing, it's going to dominate the election. And that implies a notion that it's a single issue vote. That if you're on one side of Dobbs, you're going to definitely vote Republican. If you're on the other side, you're going to definitely vote Democratic. And that's just not the way issues almost ever work. What we really are interested in is the marginal effect. How much does it shift from where you would normally vote? And a more realistic assessment of the effect is not the raw gap in Democratic vote among pro-Dobbs and anti-Dobbs folks. It's this within party and the comparison within party groups of the Dobbs opinion. And I think this is pretty convincing evidence that Dobbs had a pro-democratic effect. And in our data, over 60% opposed overturning Dobbs and 35% favored I said overturning Dobbs, sorry, mixing my cases, overturning Roe. So I think this is actually pretty strong evidence that the net effect of the abortion decision helped in this case, the gubernatorial candidate. He did not win 65-35, which if it had only been a single issue vote only on Dobbs would be what the victory would have been, right? So we didn't see that, but we did see an issue that drove people. The issue of race in the Senate race was, of course, pretty important. So here I look at the vote for Senate, and instead of comparing on Dobbs, I compare by whether you have a favorable view of Black Lives Matter or an unfavorable view of Black Lives Matter. And of course, the campaign ads tried to link Mandela Barnes in part to defund the police and in part to Black Lives Matter to various degrees of explicitness. But what you see here again is the attitude towards Black Lives Matter affected the vote for Barnes and for Johnson in reverse across every one of the party categories again. So Democrats with a positive BLM favorability, 97% for Barnes. If they were unfavorable to BLM, still a majority, but it falls to 68%. 93 to 78 in the leaning Dems and 62 to 23 with pure independents. Again, pure independents, because they don't have any partisan guide, tend to be more affected on net by the issues as they come. And again, at the bottom, you see the relatively few voters voting for Barnes among leaning Republicans or pure Republicans. But again, you still see this gap. And so here's how, in a very simple, I've only got 2 slides on this, but I think a useful way of thinking about how these two aspects of the campaigns played out and looking at them within party is, I think, a pretty reasonable way to go. I'm going to stop there and let's turn to Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charles. So I'm Ellie Powell. I'm the Booth Fowler Associate Professor of Political Science. And so I'm going to moderate our Q&A here. So if you're here in person, we're going to do what we've done throughout the day. Write your questions on one of the little note cards, and Levi will, I think, come through and bring them up. If you're joining us remotely, please put them in the Q&A function, and I'll try to get to as many questions as we have time for. Wonderful. So one of the questions that we have is about sort of thinking about this urban-rural divide that you've shown us very convincingly, and sort of asking about whether this is caused by migration or about partisan conversion over time.
Yeah.
I think.
Am I on? There you go. Feel like I'm doing a comedy routine. Can I drop the mic at the end? It's a good question, and I think it's really hard to get a definitive answer. You can think of the economic differences if you're living in the countryside, either farming or other kinds of rural activities, as opposed to more likely to be an employee in a town or a shop owner in a town, even if it's a small place. So there's that aspect of it. I don't have an answer to whether that's the driving causal mechanism. But whatever the mechanism is, we've now seen this so consistently over so many years and so many different elections that I think it bears paying real attention to, both ultimately to try to do what I can't do right now is explain why, but also from the point of view of the evolution of parties and party coalitions in the state.
Mm-hmm. No, it was so interesting to see that longer time series that you showed us. And I think that's been missed in a lot of the popular conversation that people have been focusing on about these trends.
And I'd push it that there is this tendency to say the urban-rural divide is all due to Donald Trump, but it absolutely preceded Donald Trump in this state, at least.
Yeah, so interesting. So we have another question about sort of thinking about the accuracy of election polls. So one of the really interesting things this time around is it seems like both your poll and a lot of the nonpartisan polls were pretty good, even in Wisconsin, a state where we've all struggled the last couple of election cycles. And so we have a question here about sort of what do we know about that? I guess a question about sort of like what your perspective was on the accuracy of
Sure.
polls this time
Sure.
around. And then we have some other questions about sort of exit polling and sort of understanding the accuracy of exit
Sure.
polling as a sort of separate
So,
category.
Okay. Bring me back to exits
Yeah,
if we
we'll
want to
circle back
address
to that.
that. I think the basic picture you paint is the one that I subscribe to, that the polling was better than it was. I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago at a Pollsters Association meeting looking at some of this. But it's still not definitive. We're still waiting to get final certified votes around the country and so on. So there's a little thing there. There is this supposed divide between the media, university polling, and especially the long established polls that have been around for a while, and the firms that seem to pop up. And especially this year, the accusation is that a lot of those firms had either Republican clients or they were serving Republican interests. And in the most pejorative form of it, flooded the zone with pro-Republican polling at the latter part of the campaign, and thus helped produce a perception of a red wave. And I think the analysis does show that some of those pollsters were more pro-Republican and had bigger errors this year in a Republican direction than the other older established polls. On the other hand, some of those Republican pollsters had a good year in 2020 when a lot of established polls were too Democratic. So, I think there's an easy narrative here, and I want to pull back a little bit from the easy narrative, but I want to make one really, I think, substantively important point, and that is that I have done hundreds of interviews over the last 6 years since the 2016 polling disaster. And I continued to get virtually any interview about poll results would include, at least partly, well, but we can't trust them this year, or how can we trust them this year? And again, take our lumps. We blew it in 16. I personally blew it in 16. In 20, though, I was a good bit better, though not perfect. But 18 was extremely good. 20 was quite good. And so I think the idea that polling was broken based only on 16 and based on 20, where it was more widespread errors, though it was not uniformly distributed where the errors were, has really fed the narrative that all of these polls are going to be too Democratic and you cannot trust them. So now mix that with a red wave and the idea, which, Real Clear Politics explicitly did this. They adjusted their polls for presumed bias and came up with a lot of Republican blowouts that turned out to be narrow Democratic wins, and sometimes not so narrow Democratic wins. So I think the point here is skepticism about the polling was not ill-founded given the errors that we saw in 16 and 20. But on the other hand, building that skepticism in unthinkingly really set up the narrative to be badly wrong, because it virtually couldn't entertain the idea that the polls were doing pretty good, or at least one set of polls were doing pretty good. And therefore, it just fed into the late mythology, as it turned out, of a red wave. But when you had Washington State going to a narrow tie in the polling, when it wasn't close at all in the end, that's just one of several examples where I think that narrative took over, and maybe it was partly driven by not so great polls at the end. But anyway, it's the it's the really dark side of appropriate skepticism about polling accuracy when it then feeds a counter narrative that is a partisan narrative.
Mhm. Mhm.
Exit polls?
Yeah, so a question, I wondered if maybe you could talk about sort of what exit polls are, and there's sort of a question about sort of what do we know
Yeah.
about the accuracy of exit polls, and a concern about the potential side effects if they're inaccurate.
Yeah. Oh my God. Can we get a drink while we go into this? Look, exit polls can be a really valuable tool. What they work off of is the idea that you can intercept voters as they're leaving a polling place and interview them there. Or for early voting, interview people who are coming to vote early and interview them as they're going in or coming out of the early voting place. So first of all, exit polls aren't only done on election night anymore. And so they do that kind of compensation. Some, like the Associated Press's big survey that's a competitor to the other networks, Votecast is what it's called. Fox used it for a couple of cycles now. They interview a lot of people pre-election as well as on election day to try to build up the best possible picture. So the value of them is actually not in predicting election outcomes on election night. Almost nobody would call a race only on the exit polls. But they are valuable for saying who voted for whom and why. And that, I think, has been a really important thing. The trouble is that the population of actual voters is not very well known ahead of time, right? When I do a pre-election poll and I look at what are the demographic characteristics of registered voters in the state, I have a really good basis for that from the Census Bureau that gives me that data with high quality and high confidence. But when you look at an election night exit poll, what percentage of voters are under the age of 30? Well, you don't really know. You know what percentage of what percentage of registered voters in the state are under the age of 30, because you get that from the voter file in advance. But who shows up? And if people won't talk to me on the phone, they also won't talk to people trying to interview them as they leave the voting booth. And so there's a non-response issue as well. I won't keep going on. I think there's been an unfortunate tendency to take the exit polls' final percentages as the definitive statement. And that's especially bad when it's used to say what the demographic composition of the electorate was, given that non-response and not knowing what the population parameter looks like is good. In the end, I would urge people to go to your favorite network site that has an exit poll webpage for each state, but also go to the Associated Press's Votecast system, and you'll see how much these two different and independent attempts to measure who voted for whom and why. How are they agreeing and disagreeing?
Yeah. So speaking of demographics and demographic uncertainty, we have a question from someone online asking about sort of, when you look at the margin differences between Evers and Barnes, what patterns emerge by both geographic and demographic variables, and sort of how should we think about that by size of county, by racial makeup of the geographic units?
Right.
How do all these other things interact beyond geography?
Well, first of all, you just see the gross gap of about 4 percentage points in the net margin between these two, a little over a +3 Dem in the Gov, little, right at a -1 on the Republican side. So you can look at that in the same way that I looked at the shifts. You can look at it geographically, and it looks like the gap, meaning the deficit for Barnes, if I put it that way, it was a bit bigger in the north and west, the more rural parts of the state. But we also see, some idiosyncratic differences in the Southwest, if I could call it that. On the demographic side, that's where we should turn back to the polling. And I freely confess, I haven't gotten to that stage. of looking at the gap. We know there wasn't much crossover voting within each of these races, but we do know there was a pretty substantial gap in the number of votes cast for the Democrat and the Republican candidates across the two races, and that it sure doesn't look like it was differential drop off on the ballot. The difference in turnout between the two races, total votes cast, is pretty small compared to the difference in votes. So you can construct a scenario in which one group of people are voting for governor and not Senate, and a different group of people are voting for Senate and not governor. But that starts to become not the most persuasive storyline. So I do think there was some shift in the vote. And we saw Barnes doing less well in the more rural, more Republican areas of the state. I think one thing that doesn't get talked about enough, and I'm not going to help it along very much today, but it certainly deserves revisiting, is Ron Johnson's appeal to voters who have supported him now for 3 elections. And how does that work for him in coming from behind to win in 2010 and in 2016 and in 2022? And that probably deserves more attention than I've been able to give it yet.
So we have a question here about thinking about sort of where Wisconsin is trending overall. So do you think Wisconsin is trending towards either party overall?
This is where, doing the Marquette poll now for just almost 11 years, we've done 74 statewide surveys over that time. So for the data geeks out here, it's the value of repeated polling because you get a long time series of these things. And the story is just crystal clear in our data. In 2012, when we started the poll, the state was 31% Democratic, 27% Republican. Today, it's 30% Republican, 28% Democratic. So we've gone from a net +4 or so Democratic to a net +2 Republican. Who's changed over that time? Overwhelmingly, it's white men without a college degree. In January of 2012, they were 4 points more Republican than Democrat. Today, they're 25 points more Republican than Democrat. No other demographic group over this 11-year period has changed remotely to that degree. And they're a big group. They're more than a third of voters in the state. And so if you look at non-college white women, basically flat and basically evenly divided. White college men, a bit Republican, though with some noise. They bounce around election years. White college women, very Democratic and basically pretty flat through this 11-year period. Black voters have become just a little bit less Democratic, though it appears to be mostly a growth of independent rather than a growth of Republican identification there. And remember, that's about 4 or 5% of registered voters, so a modest percentage. And with Hispanic voters, we're not seeing a trend, even though that's much talked about Hispanic voters becoming a little more Republican. We do see that a little bit in the ward level data in Milwaukee, where majority Hispanic wards in the city did move single digits in Trump's direction in 2020 compared to 16. So voting 6 or 8% less Democratic than they had in 2016. So there is some evidence that that's taking place, but it's not at this point showing up in my polling data in terms of party identification statewide.
Mm-hmm. We've talked a little bit about sort of what the media or pundit class was getting wrong prior to the 2022 election, but I guess, do you have any other thoughts about sort of what they got wrong and what lessons we could learn from this?
Well, I think the broad problem is, how do you distinguish sound analysis from a narrative or a meme or whatever? And how do you not get carried away? And that's just not easy. I think what's I perceive as different this time is that the combination of losing confidence in polling and being credulous about claims that, the Democrats suffered irrational enthusiasm over the summer, something I would actually say I think was there, the idea that, well, maybe the Democrats will gain seats in the House and sweep the Senate. That seemed kind of fantastical. But on the other hand, when the pushback came in the fall that, oh yeah, that's all passed and now it's the red wave, and it's coupled with some polling data to suggest that, I think it's a very hard job for journalists not to be influenced by that polling data, but it's also a huge problem. Let me put it this way. It was hard enough when we could kind of count on a lot of nonpartisan and media polls that had a stake primarily in being right rather than a stake in getting contracts from interest groups to do polling for them between election years. And so if now you're both skeptical of polls in general and skeptical of established polls, and there's a narrative that feeds this information, I think that's problematic. And I don't have a simple solution to it because, the established polls were wrong generally in 2020 and to a lesser extent in 16, actually a more narrow constraint. But yeah, I'm come back to me in a couple of years and I'll solve all the media's problems. Not today, though.
We have a question here about sort of asking about, how you've changed or whether you changed your polling methodology since 2016 and 2020 at
Yeah.
all, or are there any new challenges that you're facing?
Well, there's certainly challenges. On this, I'm a small c conservative. I'll change whenever there seems to be good reason to change. But we've made some changes, but they are at the margins rather than wholesale changes. Just to be clear, we were off by just over 6 points in the presidential race in 16 and off by almost 4 points or just over 4 points in the Senate race. But we had the Senate race as a toss-up, so that was actually not terrible. So that was very worrying. We'd never been that far off, and obviously it was hugely consequential. We had good company. Nobody else had Trump ahead in the state either, but that's cold comfort for a pollster. But then in 18, we had the governor's race tied. Evers won by 1.1. We had the Senate race at 11 and Baldwin won by 10.8. So you couldn't have asked for a better recovery if you want to think about it. And the changes in methodology were really minimal from one to the next. We extended the number of days that we interview a little bit. We shifted to on the vote question to pushing people. Well, if you're undecided, who would you vote for if you had to choose? This year, we shifted a little bit in the way we ask early voters. It turned out it was really clear in 2020 that if you asked, how certain are you going to vote, or have you already voted? And then you asked vote choice. You got about 8 to 10% of the early voters who refused to answer the vote choice question, a difference that was minuscule among those who hadn't yet voted. And so since they're not answering the question, you can't fill in the blank very well. This year, we just shifted the certainty of voting till after we had asked, who are you going to vote for? And lo and behold, refusals dropped to nearly zero again. And so those kinds of small changes, I think, have proven pretty good. People mistakenly think you don't call cell phones. 75% of our respondents are interviewed by cell phone. So that's really not an issue at all. The bigger trouble is people don't pick up the phone. I'm sure everybody in this room picks up every time, and you definitely should, because it might be me. If it's not me, feel free to hang up on them, but at least you need to pick up to see if it's me. But that is seriously a huge, huge problem that the entire industry faces. We've coped with it by simply spending more money to make more calls. And the good news is Democrats and Republicans alike absolutely hate scam calls. So there's not a partisan bias in refusing to answer an unknown call. And then if you pick up, first of all, we say who we are right away. I'm calling on behalf of Marquette University. And at that point, we get about 35% that agree to do an interview. So it's actually not refusals to do an interview that are huge. It's people never knowing that this unknown number was anybody, you know? Okay.
Are there we have certain types of, I guess I would say, who's the most difficult to reach demographically these days? Are there the sort of young folks?
Youngins, man. And you know, people under 30, over our history, people under 30 are 15%, 15 to 16%, depending on the year, of registered voters in the state. We would typically have 8 to 10% of people under 30 in our raw, unadjusted, unweighted sample. So we're getting somewhere a bit over half of the response rate if everybody answered. But that has slipped in the last year, and now it's half or a little under half. So the way you deal with that is with what's called post-stratification or weighting. We adjust the weight so that underrepresented groups are weighted up to their population totals, which, thanks to the voter file, we do know what the right percentage is. But that does rest on the presumption that the people that you do reach are representative of the people in that age group that you don't reach. And this slipping of a response rate with that particular age group is a challenge. And there are other groups as well. I think this is where we've moved in our national polling to online polls with people who are pre-recruited through the US mail to take part in surveys ahead of time using a probability sample of addresses around the country. So we know the probability of everybody being selected into that sample. This is the right kind of survey methodology. And then they're interviewed online. I would not mind moving to that here in Wisconsin. The trouble is it works pretty well at a national scale, but it doesn't yet work well when you scale it down to a single state. We could probably do 400 to 600 interviews with an online panel here in the state pretty easily. But I need to do 8 to 12 polls over the course of the year, and I don't want to be talking to the same people every time. I want fresh cross sections, and that's the thing that phone still is unparalleled at getting me a fresh group of people every month, whereas the online panels, you really don't have at the state level a big enough set of people who've been recruited to do the kind of repeated polling that we do. So I don't know where we'll be in 2 years.
We'll just have to have you back and you'll explain it. Speaking of young voters, we had a question about sort of how young people influence the election. Did they turn out? What did they look like?
Yeah, I think there is still some debate about how big the turnout was among the young. There's sort of conflicting narratives from different groups. The bottom line is that ultimately we'll know from the voter lists when those are updated what the real turnout was among each age group. And we'll know that for basically every state in the country. Only a few states have updated their voter lists at this point. And Wisconsin certainly hasn't. So it will be spring sometime at the earliest before I think we have really good evidence for it. This is where those exit polls bother me a bit, because some folks are citing the percentages of young people in the exit polls, but that percentage is highly, highly driven by the assumptions the pollsters made about where to weight those folks. What's the target that you think they'll be? So this is a case where I'd be really reticent to take exit poll data on the percentage of young, or for that matter, old voters. And as discouraging as it is to say, wait until May when the data come out, wait until May when the data come out. We will have by May or maybe June, the Census Bureau's study of this every election year in November after the election. The census asks well over 100,000 people nationwide whether you were registered to vote, did you vote, how did you register at the DMV or some other way, did you vote early or on election day? And that for a long time has been a really critical standard. On the other hand, it is people self-reporting whether they voted or not. So this is where the advent of voter files really helps us get that estimate a lot better. But again, later, much, much later.
We have a question here about the, I don't know if you've looked at the third congressional district in particular and sort of whether you have any thoughts on the sort of partisan movement that you've seen there since about 2010?
Well, the third has been moving in a Republican direction, voted for Trump twice, having previously voted Democratic. Ron Kind, Democratic congressman, had held that seat for a long time. On the other hand, the race turned out to be a 4-point win for the Republican. And so it wasn't as large of a movement in a Republican direction as I think many people had thought. And it is true that the national Democratic organizations, the DCCC and others, largely pulled out of that race. Now, I think it's easy to assume that if they'd only tried a little harder, that race could have been flipped. Well, remember, the House is, I think, Kyle, you can fix this for me, 222 to 213 is our guess now. Well, I don't know that you want to be too critical of the DCCC when they kept the House as close as that. You gotta ask what other races were decided by less than a 4-point margin that you would have moved that money into before you poured it into the third. Having said that, we've now gone from a 3-Dem 5 Republican to a 2-Dem 6 Republican congressional delegation, and incumbency will make that harder for Democrats to take back. On the other hand, just to not be too much, things are the way they are and they'll never change. So remember how much things have changed in the last decade here. And so I don't think we want to get completely locked into the idea that there couldn't be candidates or issues that at least at the margin shift some of our seats. The one other seat that has turned out to be competitive is the 1st congressional district down on the Illinois border, Paul Ryan's old district. And in the redistricting process, that one turned out not to lean as strongly Republican as it had in the past. So that's another case where in a pro-democratic year with national forces pushing in a Democratic direction, the 1st district could be pretty competitive. I wouldn't forecast easy Democratic victories by any means, but pretty competitive. The third, if it really is a 4-point district, could be competitive in pro-democratic years. So there's some room for change in both of those.
We have a question here about sort of how enduring you think the shifts towards the Democrats in the WOW counties, essentially
Yes.
the Republican counties that surround Milwaukee, and then towards the Republicans in the rural areas are.
Both of them look strong and continuing. 2020, the 3 WOW counties cast 40,000 fewer net votes for the Republican candidate than they had 4 years earlier. This year, they're again substantially net more Democratic votes. And Washington County hadn't moved very much. A lot of that movement is Ozaukee and Waukesha. I think one thing we're seeing is from a statewide perspective, how valuable losing while getting 40% of the vote is compared to losing with 30% of the vote. And that's part of, I think, it comes from, there are some changing demographics in the suburban counties, but it also comes from Democrats working really hard to organize in those counties. If you think, I used to use this example back in the old days that if you think of Waukesha County as 75-25, and you show up at a nonpartisan breakfast and you're sitting at tables of 8, there's a pretty decent chance that 2 of the people at that table are Democrats. And so you'd actually encounter Democrats even in heavily Waukesha. And of course, I'd flip it and do the same story for Dane, that same kind of thing. See, we don't think of that minority as being anything more than a trivial minority, but think about it at the breakfast table, and it's actually not trivial at all. Letting people be aware of that and building the notion that you're not the only member of whichever the minority party is, Republicans here, Democrats there, I think is an empowering sense for people to participate. And my impression, is no more than an impression, is that the party organizations, especially in the WOW counties on the Dem side, have been doing quite a job in building that up. I've also become a fan of yard signs, God help me, because they are a way to show your neighbors that you exist. I have thought about putting a randomized experiment of yard signs in neighborhoods here in the town, but I think that would probably be a mistake.
I also will have just one final question here, asking about sort of what correlation there is between turnout and income, or sort of do you see
Yeah.
wealthier folks be more likely to turn out?
Yeah.
And
Education and age are the more powerful predictors of turnout, though higher incomes do tend to turn out more, but then they also tend to be more educated and older on average. The thing with age that we talked about earlier is that in most midterms, we see people under 30 turning out among registered voters at rates among all adults in that, and adult citizens in that group, at rates between 20 and 40%, with 40 being a real high level mark. That's 2018 turnout was 40%. But geezers like me turn out at 65 to 80%. And that gradient of rising turnout with age has just been rock solid for decades now. In an individual election, you can see everybody go up or everybody come down. In some years, and 2018 is a good example of this, you see young people turn out at relatively higher rates than usual. So it flattens the curve, but it's still a rising curve for that. We can't do much to change people's age. And after a certain point, we don't do much to change their education. Well, we could try direct payments for income, but I think the point here is that when you take those demographic characteristics into effect, it's a good example of why organizing and outreach and campaigning are awfully important. And so I would leave that on the table, that these demographic factors are really important, but they're relatively static, and campaigns and mobilization efforts can shift those patterns up or conceivably down in meaningful ways. So
well, I think
demographics not quite destiny, I guess.
well, I think that's a perfect note to wrap up on. Please join me. Thank you for thanking Professor Franklin. And then I think Barry Burden has a few closing remarks for us before we conclude for the day.
I promise they are few closing remarks. I think this has been a really terrific day, fun, interesting, enlightening. The speakers have been terrific. I really appreciate my colleagues here at UW-Madison and facilitating the discussions. There aren't many places where you could have a dialogue like this for 8 hours with lots of audience questions. I don't remember an event on campus where we have gotten such a large number and high quality of questions from an in-person audience and an online audience. Those were coming in all day. We have stacks of index cards and questions in the Zoom that we did not get to. So I appreciate you all making this first ever really large scale hybrid event for the Elections Research Center a success. I hope you'll be back with us in 2024. We're booking now 2 years out, so put it on your calendars, December after the next United States presidential election. We plan to be here. But these are not the only things that the Elections Research Center does. So if you're interested in this kind of analysis, other events we'll be putting on even next year, an odd numbered year, believe it or not, we care about these things. Please follow us, visit our website, which is elections.wisc.edu. There's a newsletter there that you can sign up for. We won't spam you. It's just a couple mailings a year. We have Twitter and Facebook accounts and maybe other social media accounts at some point. Recorded video of today's event will also be distributed on those channels. So if there's something you didn't see and want to catch, or a bit you'd like to look at again, that will be there in perpetuity. So thank you all again. We appreciate having you. Thanks.